Discrimination is currently a structural problem that marginalizes, harms, limits, and punishes all kinds of people. As we saw in the previous video, conventions are valuable anti-discrimination tools that are currently approved by the OAS. But it doesn't end there. Signature and ratification by the member states is required to make them binding in our countries. Okay, so the convention's passed. What now? We will focus on 5 steps. First, we will focus on knowing the text and the procedure for ratification. As a second step, we will create a national alliance and then we will design and implement an action plan. Finally, we need to consider the next steps. Let's start here. Let's see. It is clear that we must know exactly what we're talking about to take the necessary action to have these institutional instruments ratified. Let's imagine that we must talk about human rights and related issues to someone that isn't familiar with the purposes of the conventions. If we do not know the contents perfectly, we will limit ourselves to having a repetitive speech, thus making the conversation very technical. And yes, it will also be very tedious and not very emotional. They will not understand us and we won't be able to connect and empathize with a person. To prevent this, we will need to properly study the conventions and spend time creating a summary and our own adapted explanation in order to communicate more effectively. A second important question is to know which constitutional mechanism our country must follow to ratify said conventions. This implies 2 issues. First, the mechanism established by our constitution which must be followed for ratification. Second, the hierarchy of the ratified instrument in our constitutional order. In other words, we must investigate who should take the first step in the ratification process. In this process, it is usual for entities of the executive branch, such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to analyze the conventions to verify their compatibility with the constitutional norms. Once this is confirmed, the usual practice is that the President gives the approval, signs the conventions, and sends them to Parliament to be passed into law. This is when the activists come in. They must identify allied parliamentarians who can lead the process of these ratifications in Parliament. That is why it is essential to have a good knowledge of the conventions and how the constitutional order is governed in our countries, so that we know which our goals are and who to address. Okay, now we know the basics. Discrimination must also be placed in the public debate. This is why it is extremely important to create national alliances. Belonging to or creating an alliance allows us to diversify our purposes in the fight against discrimination. And not only will we achieve and strengthen an initiative, but we will also prevent our issues from being referred to as minority problems. This alliance can be made up of organizations that work on different issues, which will help us to make progress in terms of promoting rights. We're not done yet. This is when we have to talk about how to design and implement an action plan. Once the alliance is formed, we must draw up a strategy to have the conventions ratified. For this, it is important that the alliances hold at least one session to analyze the current situation of the country with all the member organizations. For this, it is useful to ask ourselves some basic questions, from what is the position of the current government regarding discrimination and equality, as well as its position on the conventions. If the government is hindering the signature or ratification, and also what is the attitude of the general public or the popular sector in the country towards discrimination, among others. There is an important point that we must consider to achieve the ratification of the conventions. We must study all the institutional actors that will intervene in this process, political parties and legislators and their positions regarding the conventions, for, against, or neutral. This is called actors mapping. In addition to all this, it will be useful to know the relevance, also called political weight, of each actor, the person's profile, and who could influence that person. As the interpretation of our message will be different in each sector and each person, we must also develop a discursive framing that is compatible with the type of actors and the institutional and popular political environment in the country. Remember that what's important is to guarantee a plurality of voices in the public discourse of the campaign. We now have to define the activities to be carried out, that is, clarify what steps to take, to identify those responsible, the deadlines and necessary resources, in addition to the resources that are available based on the objectives and planned activities. Some of the activities we suggest are lobbying the government and communication campaigns. On the one hand, lobbying consists of showing the government support for signing or ratifying the conventions, and it also allows us to explain the benefits of ratifying them. Usually, the first step is to send a letter, a request to the government to ratify the conventions, since they could agree to do it upon this first request. The letter should be clearly structured, starting with a brief introduction of the alliance that signs the letter, a brief explanation of the purpose of the letter, a demonstration of some of the benefits for the government and how these goals would be achieved. Also, it should be a brief text. Indeed, the truth is that including more details than necessary can make it an excessive letter. What we can do is attach relevant material to the letter, such as materials from the communication campaign, or promotional elements such as pins or pens. In case contact is made by telephone, the initial contact must be notified of the call in advance, as far as possible of course. An appropriate and friendly relationship must be established with the person answering the phone. This person can be the one who will ensure that our message reaches the relevant official. Once this is done, we have to prepare. We must have a discursive plan for the future call, arguments to present, possible objections and how to respond to them. We must be brief and clear, not abuse time, and we must take notes of everything we talk about. Well, up to this point we have discussed distance communications. But what do we do when we have to attend a meeting? Let's start with the basics. Before a meeting we must do our research, that is, to know the facts and gather as much information as possible. If possible, gather all the information about the attendance of the meeting. It is very important not to attend the meeting without company, and to appoint experienced representatives who can answer difficult questions. Finally, it is important to maintain confidentiality in order to build trust with the person we are meeting. Now we are at the meeting, and the difficulty of some questions can work against us. Therefore, if we do not know how to respond to some of them, it is better not to do so at the meeting, but rather in a follow-up call after the meeting. This is also the reason why it's so important not to attend the meeting without company. You won't be alone, and will be able to rely on your team to respond appropriately. Finally, a summary of the agreements and next steps must be made before leaving the meeting. Well, this is a point when we talk about communication campaigns, but first we will look into two different situations, before ratification and after ratification. Before ratification, we must define campaign messages that explain the contents of the conventions and address myths or messages installed by opponents, and define the media to be used, among other things. Potential communication activities include press conferences, communication pieces such as videos, audios, digital flyers, among others. After the ratification, communication actions will be aimed at disseminating the rights recognized by the conventions and promoting the enforcement and guarantee of their provisions. Well, so far we have seen the importance of the recognition of the conventions, the creation of a national alliance, and the implementation of an action plan to achieve their ratification. But this work entails ongoing assessment and objective self-criticism. This will help improve our weaknesses, we'll learn from our mistakes, and enhance the result of our decisions. Assessment includes the ongoing analysis of changes in the context, for example, an upcoming election or the change of a government official in a key position. Finally, we must think about the next steps, even if the state has expressed its refusal to sign or ratify the conventions. If the state has expressed its refusal, we must analyze the reasons for this. It is worth evaluating which communication actions to follow and how the alliance will continue, from changing the tone of the message to taking a break until the social-political context in the country changes. If the state has signed the conventions, the entire process must start again, this time to influence the parliament, who may or may not continue the ratification process. If ratification is finally achieved, it is necessary to consider the role the alliance will play in this new phase. Subsequent work is intended to harmonize national legislation with the provisions of the conventions. Regardless of whether or not we achieve ratification, the process is slow and requires patience and dedication. Achieving the ratification is a very important step for the equality of all people in the country. So if it's achieved, we must celebrate, and if not, don't be discouraged, because inequality and discrimination never cease.